You should go home." My son said it right there on the wedding dance floor while I was still holding a glass of champagne I hadn't even set down yet. Not whispered, not softened, not apologized for. Just 4 words, enough to push me out of the room where I had paid for every flower, every song, every forced smile that day. I looked at my daughter-in-law. She didn't say a word, just smiled. A very slight smile. And in that moment, I understood. This wasn't just a wedding. This was an erasure. If you're still listening, tell me where you're watching from. Every comment you leave is another mark in this journey. And if this story has touched you, don't forget to hit like so it can reach even further. I stood frozen for a few seconds, as if someone had pulled all the air out of my lungs. The music kept playing behind me, a soft jazz tune from the live band, the trumpet weaving through the cheerful chatter of hundreds of guests. Silk dresses brushed across the polished wooden floor. Glasses clinked together, bright and celebratory. No one noticed me. No one knew that, in that exact moment, I had just been pushed out of my own son's life. My name is Judith Monroe, 63 years old, a widowed mother who has spent more than half her life in Colorado in an old log house sitting on land my family has protected for 3 generations. I used to think I was a strong woman. I believed there was nothing left that could break me. After my husband died 12 years ago, after endless overnight hospital shifts, after crying while paying my son's college tuition bills. But I was wrong. Ethan's wedding, my only son, was held at a luxury resort in Napa Valley, more than 8 hours' drive from my home. Claire said she had always dreamed of a vineyard wedding where the afternoon sun fell across long tables dressed in white linen, where everything looked like it came straight out of a lifestyle magazine. I nodded the moment Ethan asked if I could help cover some of the cost. In truth, it wasn't some. I paid most of it. I didn't tell anyone that to come up with that money, I drained nearly all of my retirement savings. I didn't say that I picked up extra night shifts at the hospital even when my back hurt so badly I had to lean against the wall just to stand upright. I didn't say that I kept telling myself, this is the last time, the last gift for my son. A mother shouldn't keep score, right? At least that's what I believed. I arrived 2 hours early on the wedding day. The California weather was gently sunny, warm, the scent of ripe grapes drifting in the air. I wore a navy blue, knee-length dress, classic, understated, the exact style Claire had sent me months earlier with a short message, "Formal attire only." The dress cost nearly $400. I stood in front of the mirror for a long time that morning, wondering if I was trying too hard. Then I smiled at myself. The groom's mother should look the part, I thought. The ceremony was flawless. Claire walked down the aisle between rows of white chairs, her fitted lace gown, her blonde hair pinned neatly like a princess. Ethan stood at the end, shoulders straight, eyes bright. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, I cried. I cried out of happiness, out of longing for my husband, who wasn't there to see this day, and out of a naive belief that all my sacrifices had finally meant something. After the ceremony, the reception began. I stood near the dessert table holding my champagne glass, watching Ethan laugh with his friends. I was waiting for a quiet moment to give him the envelope I had brought. Inside was a check I had signed the week before, my hand shaking so badly I had to sign it twice to keep the letters straight. I imagined hugging him, whispering how proud I was. That moment never came. Ethan walked toward me, his face tight. Not the stress of a busy groom, but the firmness of someone who had already made a decision and didn't intend to change it. When he said those words, "You should go home," I thought I must have misheard him. I gave a small, awkward smile, about to ask him to repeat himself, but his eyes left no room for doubt. "Claire is uncomfortable," he added, his voice lower but cold. "You're stressing her out." Around us, everything continued as normal. A middle-aged man tried to dance near the stage, making a few people laugh. A server bent down to straighten a tablecloth. No one looked our way, and maybe that was what hurt the most. I was being kicked out of my son's wedding, and the world didn't even pause for a breath. I wanted to say so many things. I wanted to ask why. I wanted to remind him that I hadn't said a single word to Claire all evening, that I had tried to turn myself into a shadow just to avoid bothering anyone. I wanted to scream that I was his mother, that I had paid for every detail in that room, but nothing came out. I looked at Claire. She was seated at the head table, one hand resting lightly on her wine glass, her lips curved into a small, very small smile. No one else would have noticed anything in it, but I did. I had lived long enough to recognize victory when it hid behind perfect politeness. I nodded. Just a very slight nod. I set my champagne glass down on the dessert table. The base touched the glass surface with a soft, sharp click. I turned, picked up my purse, and walked away. I didn't look back. I didn't search for my son's eyes one last time. I was afraid that if I did, I would collapse right there. The path to the parking lot was long and bright with sun. My heels struck the stone in steady rhythm. Each step felt like a countdown. When the large doors closed behind me, the music and laughter were cut off abruptly. All that remained was silence and the distant sound of cicadas. I stood there for a moment, breathing deeply, forcing my shoulders not to shake. I had left many places in my life. Left the emergency room after overnight shifts, left the cemetery after my husband's funeral, left old rental houses when Ethan was young. But never had I felt erased like this. When I got into the car, my hands tightened around the steering wheel without thinking. I didn't turn on the radio, I didn't call anyone. I just sat there looking back at the glowing resort in the late afternoon light. Inside, my son was raising a glass to his future, and I, the woman who had built the foundation for that future, was left on the outside, like an unnecessary detail. I started the car and drove away. The road out of the valley wound through endless rows of vineyards. The setting sun painted everything in soft shades of gold and orange. It should have been peaceful. But inside me, something was slowly freezing, not a burst of anger, but a cold, terrifying clarity. I began connecting the dots. Claire's subtle remarks in the months before, the way she always stepped in whenever Ethan and I tried to talk privately, the annoyed looks when I asked about his plans for the future, and then today, "You should go home." It wasn't an impulsive decision, not wedding stress, not a small misunderstanding. It was the result of a process I had refused to see because I trusted motherhood too much. I drove for hours until the sky turned fully dark. With every mile, a thought took shape in my mind, slow but steady like tires rolling along the highway. If I could be erased from my son's wedding today, what would I be erased from tomorrow? The question echoed again and again like a warning, and I had no idea that only a few hours later, that question would become real, in a way I could never have imagined. I drove that long stretch in a strange state, not crying, not shaking, not panicking, just a deep emptiness, as if someone had finally lifted a heavy stone I had carried on my chest for years, leaving my ribs exposed, aching, but also lighter in a strange way. The highway grew emptier. Long lines of yellow lights stretched endlessly, like a chain of memories I had tried to neatly fold away throughout my years as a mother. And then, almost by instinct, I began thinking of Ethan from long ago. Not the man who had just asked me to leave his wedding, but the small boy who used to grip my hand tightly when our world fell apart. My husband died when Ethan was 11. It was a winter morning, snow still dusting the lawn in front of our house. Marcus, my husband, collapsed in the kitchen while making coffee. A fast, merciless heart attack that gave us no chance to say goodbye. I still remember the sound of the ceramic mug shattering on the tile floor, Ethan calling for his dad as he ran downstairs, and the heavy silence that followed. The silence that told me nothing would ever be the same again. I became a single mother in the span of one morning. The years that followed blurred into a long stretch without pause. I worked as a nurse at a local hospital, first-day shifts only. But Marcus's life insurance wasn't enough to last, and the mortgage was still there. I took evening shifts, then nights. There were weeks when I worked 6 days straight, 12 hours a day, coming home after Ethan was asleep and leaving again while he was still groggy at the breakfast table. I missed so much. Parent-teacher meetings I attended in my scrubs, school performances where I stood at the back of the auditorium, afraid Ethan would see how exhausted I was. But I never missed the most important thing, being there. I was there when he was sick, when he was bullied at school, when his first real heartbreak left him crying in his room for an entire evening. I learned how to be both mother and father, even though I never believed I was good enough at either. I remember summer evenings when Ethan and I sat at the kitchen table, books spread everywhere. I made tea to stay awake while he worked through math problems, brow furrowed in concentration. Sometimes I was so tired the words on the page blurred, but I stayed, just so he knew I wasn't going anywhere. I remember all the times I said no to myself. No new clothes, no vacations, no renovations I wanted to make to the house. Everything went into Ethan's college fund. When his acceptance letter arrived, I held him and cried, not from pride, but from relief. I had done it, at least up to that point. When Ethan met Claire, he was 26. I first met her over dinner at our house. Claire was polite, proper, but there was an invisible distance I couldn't name. She spoke softly, her smile always measured. Never more, never less. I told myself it was just her personality. Not everyone is warm, and I didn't want to be the meddling mother-in-law. I tried to keep myself on the edges of their lives. I didn't give opinions unless asked. I didn't show up unannounced. I didn't bring up the past. I thought that was respect. But there were small signs I chose to ignore. The way Claire hesitated when I entered a room. How she gripped Ethan's hand a little tighter whenever I asked about their plans. The short, polite, but distant replies, as if every conversation with me was an obligation to be completed. When they announced their engagement, I was genuinely happy for my son. When Ethan asked if I could help pay for the wedding, I didn't hesitate. I thought it was an important milestone, something I should contribute to so he could start well. I didn't tell Ethan that the amount was far more than I had expected. I sat down with an old notebook and added everything up. I withdrew from savings. I took out a small loan from the local credit union. I sold my old car and bought a cheaper one. I cut back on things that seemed small. No eating out, no new books, no weekend coffee. I told myself I would make it up later, after the wedding, after things settled. Each time I transferred money to the event planners, Claire sent a short message. "Thank you, Judith." No emojis, no follow-up. I reread those words and told myself I was being too sensitive. A few weeks before the wedding, I began to feel unnecessary. The big decisions had already been made. I was informed, not consulted. When I made a very gentle comment about the location, only that it might be far for older relatives, Claire smiled and said, "We've already decided." Not harsh, but final. I swallowed the rest of my words. I kept soothing myself with a single sentence, repeated like a prayer. As long as my son is happy, that's enough. I said it to friends, to relatives, to myself. I believed motherhood meant stepping back when needed, letting go at the right time. I believed that if I stayed quiet long enough, everything would be fine. The truth was, I didn't realize I was being pushed out, little by little. When the wedding day arrived, I thought all the small tensions would disappear, that it would be a day about love and family. I prepared myself to smile, to stand behind the scenes, to be the kind of mother I was supposed to be. Quiet, proud, undemanding. I never imagined I would be asked to leave. Now, driving through the darkness, I began to see every piece with new clarity. Details I once thought harmless arranged themselves into a picture so clear it made my skin go cold. I realized I had confused sacrifice with self-erasure. I believed love meant giving without conditions, but I had never asked, what happens when that giving is no longer valued? I didn't know then that the wedding was only the first step. But as my tires rolled steadily over the road and old memories settled into silence, a sense of unease began to grow, slow, heavy, impossible to shake. Something was coming, something bigger, colder, and deep down I understood that the price I had paid for that special day was not the final price yet. I kept driving through the night, letting the road pull me farther away from that glowing vineyard valley. My headlights swept across road signs, dark rows of trees standing still on either side of the highway. The dashboard clock crept closer to midnight. I didn't turn on the radio. The silence in the car was so thick I could hear my own breathing, the steady hiss of tires on dew-damp pavement. At times I felt like misplaced luggage on the wrong conveyor belt, pushed along, left behind, no one looking back. The feeling didn't explode into anger or spill into tears. It lingered, stubborn and dull, like a bruise beneath the skin. I thought about the moment Ethan spoke those words, about the way his eyes avoided mine, about Claire's barely there smile. It all replayed in my mind without sound or color, leaving only the cold shape of the truth. I stopped at a small roadside gas station to refuel. The convenience store glowed under fluorescent lights, smelling of burnt coffee and stale pastries. The young cashier smiled out of habit as I handed over my card, unaware that the woman standing in front of her had just been erased from a family she herself had built. I bought a bottle of water, took a small sip, then set it on the passenger seat. My throat was dry, but I wasn't thirsty. I just needed to pause long enough to prove to myself that I was still moving forward, that the wheels were still turning. When I pulled back onto the road, the air grew cooler. The highway gave way to narrower roads winding through pine forests. I recognized the familiar scent of the mountains, sap, damp earth, night air heavy with mist. That smell guided me home, faster than any road sign ever could. And then after the final bend, I saw the old wooden gate appear in my headlights. The house stood there, as it had for decades, unpretentious, unpolished. Just a 2-story log house with a sloped roof, a wide porch, and the warm yellow glow of the porch light I always left on when I traveled. I turned off the engine and sat for a moment, hands still on the steering wheel. The silence here was different from the silence on the road. It wasn't empty. It was dense, deep, filled with memory. I stepped out of the car. Gravel crunched under my heels. The cold air raised goosebumps on my skin, but I didn't rush inside. I stood there, looking at the house the way you look at someone you love after a long absence. Dark windows, the wooden porch swing creaking softly in the night breeze. Everything familiar, painfully so. This wasn't just a house. This was where my grandfather stood every morning with a cup of coffee, watching the sun rise over the mountains. This was where my father hammered each plank of the barn out back, sweat dripping onto the ground in the heat of summer. And this was where Marcus and I carried Ethan home from the hospital, a tiny bundle wrapped in white, crying when the cold air touched his cheeks. This land, 40 acres, was the greatest emotional inheritance of my life, not because of its market value, though I knew it was worth a great deal, but because every inch carried the footsteps of people I loved. Every tall oak at the forest's edge was planted by my father when I was still a girl. Every wooden fence bore my grandfather's hammer marks. And this house. Marcus repaired the porch roof with his own hands in the final autumn before he passed. I opened the door and stepped inside. I didn't turn on the lights right away. I let myself stand in the dark, letting my eyes adjust to the space. The smell of old wood, the soap I used to mop the floors, the faint warmth left behind from a long day. All of it wrapped around me like an invisible blanket. I set my bag down on the chair and hung my coat on the hook by the door. Every movement was slow, as if I were afraid of disturbing the fragile quiet that covered the house. I walked into the living room. The armchair Marcus used to sit in was by the window. The coffee table had an old scratch on the corner, where Ethan once dropped a toy car when he was little. On the mantel were photo frames faded by time. I didn't look closely, but I knew every picture there. I didn't need light to see them. I sat down in the armchair, my hand resting on the armrest worn smooth by years of use. In that moment, the memory of Marcus felt so vivid, I could almost hear his voice, low, slow, always carrying a hint of a smile even when he talked about serious things. I clearly remembered the last night we sat here together, talking about the future. Ethan was already grown then, getting ready for college. Marcus worried that I would struggle on my own if he were gone. I brushed it off, told him he was thinking too much. "Judith," he said, his voice weak but firm. "No matter what happens, you have to hold on to this land. Don't let anyone turn it into something that can be bought and sold. It's our family." I nodded. Back then, I never imagined that promise would become so heavy. That night, I didn't cry. The tears felt stuck somewhere, refusing to fall. I sat in the dark for a long time, listening only to the steady ticking of the wall clock. Each tick sounded like a step backward in time, carrying me to the years when I still believed family was something nothing could shake. I made a cup of tea, but let it go cold on the table. I didn't feel like drinking it. I just needed something in my hands to remind myself that I was still here, in this house, on this land. Outside, the wind moved through the pine trees, creating a familiar whispering sound. Normally, that sound comforted me. Tonight, it made me feel smaller than ever. I stood up and stepped out onto the back porch. The night sky stretched wide, full of stars. Pale moonlight fell over the distant field, where wild grass swayed gently. I remembered summer evenings when Ethan ran barefoot across the lawn, laughing as Marcus chased after him. I remembered the sound of Mom calling out from far away, full of trust. Those memories didn't come to comfort me. They came to remind me that something had changed forever. A vague but unmistakable sense settled in my chest. What happened today wasn't the end. It felt like the first crack of thunder signaling a storm forming far offshore. The surface was still calm, the sky still clear, but the air had changed. I went back inside, locked the door, and turned the lights off again. I didn't want light. I wanted the house to stay like this, silent, waiting. I went upstairs, changed my clothes, and lay down on the bed without pulling the covers up. The ceiling appeared dimly in the moonlight slipping through the curtains. I stared at it for a long time, letting my thoughts drift without clinging to any single one. Before slipping into a shallow, restless sleep, a thought slid into my mind, light but sharp as a blade. If my son could throw me out of his wedding, what else would he be willing to take from me? I didn't know the answer, but somewhere deep inside, I knew that the calm of that night was only a thin shell, and I was afraid, not of the dark, not of being alone, but because I was beginning to understand that the real storm was still ahead. I woke up just as the sky began to lighten. Sunlight, thin as a veil of mist, slipped through the curtains and fell onto the cold wooden floor. My body felt heavy, not from lack of sleep, but from a deep weariness inside, as if I had carried an invisible weight through the entire night. I sat up slowly, set my feet on the floor, and listened as the house woke up with me. The soft creak of wood, the wind slipping through the window frame, the first birds calling from the distant pine trees. Everything looked normal, suspiciously normal. I made coffee, a habit I never broke. The smell filled the kitchen, warm and familiar. I leaned against the counter, mug in hand, and looked out the back window. Dew still clung to the grass. The old wooden barn stood quiet in the distance. There was no sign that the day before I had been pushed out of my son's wedding, as if it had all been a bad dream washed away by morning light. My phone vibrated just as I set the mug down. Ethan's name appeared on the screen. For a brief moment, I thought, naively, that he was calling to apologize, that he had reconsidered after his wedding night, that he realized what he had done was wrong. My heart skipped, not because of grand hope, but because of the old reflex of a mother always ready to forgive. I answered. "Hi, Mom," Ethan said, his voice so normal it stopped me short. No hesitation, no uncertainty, no trace of the emotions I had carried all night. "Did you make it home safely?" I was silent for a second. "Yes," I said. My voice was dry but steady. "I'm home." "Good," he continued, as if checking something off a list. "Hey, Mom, do you have a minute to talk?" I looked out the window again, where sunlight had begun to touch the trunk of the old oak tree. "I'm listening." There was a very brief pause on the other end. Then Ethan spoke, his tone turning strangely upbeat, like when he was little and about to share a new idea. "Claire and I talked last night. We think it's time to talk about the land." I frowned but said nothing. "The land paperwork," Ethan went on a bit faster, as if afraid I might interrupt. "Can you send me a copy? Or better yet, the original? I need to look it over." It felt like someone had just dumped a bucket of cold water over my head. The paperwork. "For the land?" I repeated, not to question him, but to give myself time to understand what he had just said. "Yeah," he replied casually. "Our land. The 40 acres. I figured you knew what I meant." I leaned back against the counter, my hand gripping the edge of the marble. Part of me still couldn't believe this conversation was happening. Less than 12 hours after I'd been told to leave his wedding, my son was calling to ask about property documents. "What for?" I asked. My voice was low and even, unfamiliar even to me. Ethan let out a small, relieved breath, as if we had finally reached the important part. "Well, to talk plans. You know, leaving land unused is a waste. Claire and I think we could develop it." "Develop it?" I repeated. Yeah, he said, growing more animated. Build a few houses, maybe divide it into lots. Sell them. The market is really good right now, Mom. People are willing to pay a lot for land like that, especially near forest and mountains. I closed my eyes. The image of the old barn, the crooked fence, the oak trees my father planted appeared so clearly it hurt. Ethan, I said slowly, you're talking about our family land. I know, he replied, still calm. But look at it, Mom. It's too much for one person. Maintenance is exhausting, and you're not young anymore. That sentence, you're not young anymore, landed like a clean cut, not cruel, not angry, just a truth spoken too easily. Claire and her family know some people in construction, Ethan continued. Her dad has a friend in real estate. Her uncle did a similar project in Arizona. We've already talked it through a bit. If we move fast, we could split the land, build vacation-style homes, and sell them in a few years. I opened my eyes. The familiar kitchen suddenly felt foreign, like I was standing in someone else's house. So, you've already planned everything? Not exactly, Ethan said quickly, correcting himself. Just preliminary talk, to see what you think. I gave a soft laugh, empty of humor. Are you asking me, or informing me? There was a brief silence. Then Ethan said, his voice lower, more practical. Mom, I just want what's best for everyone. This is a big opportunity. If it sells, you'll have money to live more comfortably. You could move somewhere smaller, easier to manage. I pictured myself in a senior living community, trimming artificial grass, playing bingo on Wednesday afternoons. I pictured this land leveled, the oak trees cut down, the barn dismantled, all of it wrapped up in 2 words, big opportunity. What does Claire think? I asked, even though I already knew. She's very supportive, Ethan answered immediately. Her family too. Everyone thinks this is the logical move. I nodded, though he couldn't see me. The final pieces fell into place. The lavish wedding, my quiet removal, this morning's call. Nothing was scattered anymore. It all lined up into one cold, straight line. So, Ethan continued, his tone slightly pressing, can you send the paperwork this week so we can review the details? I took a deep breath. The morning air suddenly felt heavy. Do you know, I asked slowly, that your grandfather spent nearly his entire life holding on to that land? I know the history, Mom, Ethan replied, a hint of impatience creeping in. But we have to live in the present. We can't cling to the past forever. That sentence ended all remaining doubt inside me. The wedding wasn't the destination. It was just a stepping stone, a stage dressed up, beautifully enough to hide the real goal behind it. And I, the mother, was simply an obstacle that needed to be removed so the plan could move forward smoothly. I looked down at my hands. The veins stood out, the skin thin with age. These were the hands that had changed bandages, given injections, worked without rest. The hands that had held my son's hand when he was afraid. And now, these same hands were being asked to give everything away. Ethan, I said, my voice so calm it surprised even me. I need time. Time? He repeated. How long? For now, I said. I'll think about it. There was a light sigh on the other end. Fine, but think fast. The market doesn't wait for anyone. I ended the call before he could say anything else. The kitchen fell silent again. The wall clock ticked steadily, reminding me that time kept moving, no matter what had just happened. I stood there for a long while, watching sunlight slowly fill the room, touch the table, the cabinets, the old photo near the door, the one of Marcus standing on this land, smiling gently, his hand resting on Ethan's shoulder when he was still a boy. I realized then that a mother's love can be weighed and measured like any other asset. And that morning in my familiar kitchen, I understood that I hadn't just lost my place in my son's wedding. I had been placed on the scale. After that call, I didn't do anything right away. I didn't call Ethan back. I didn't text him. I just stood in the kitchen for a long time, letting the wall clock keep counting seconds as it had for decades. Then I put on my jacket and stepped outside. Mornings on this land always had a beauty of their own. Sunlight cut through the pine trees at an angle, falling onto ground still damp with dew. The air was cool, carrying the scent of wild grass and sap. I walked slowly along the familiar dirt path leading to the field behind the house. Each step felt like it was pulling me backward through time, returning me to days when everything here was tied to the voices of people long gone. My grandfather bought this land in the early 1950s. He had just returned from the war, carrying nothing but a small amount of money saved from years of hard labor. He chose this place because it was wild, because people thought no one would want to live on land so remote, rocky, and forested. But to him, it was a beginning. He built a small log house with his own hands, planted the first trees to mark the boundaries. He told my father, "Land won't betray you as long as you don't betray it." My father grew up here. He expanded the house, built the barn, put up fences. He planted oak trees along the small creek, believing that one day his grandchildren would sit beneath their shade. When I was a child, I thought this land was the whole world. I ran barefoot through the grass, scraped my knees, got bandaged by my father, then ran off again. Every scratch, every scar belonged to a specific corner of this land. They never disappeared, only faded with time. Marcus, my husband, fell in love with this land the first time he stepped onto it. He wasn't born here, but he chose to stay. He repaired the roof, reinforced the foundation, expanded the front porch. He planted fruit trees, saying Ethan would grow up alongside them. And when Ethan was born, this land witnessed my son's first steps, his laughter echoing across the fields. All of that. Those afternoons, those long winters, those sweltering summers couldn't be measured in money. They had no market price. No contract recorded them. But they existed, clearly and stubbornly, in every layer of soil, every piece of wood, every memory I carried. And yet, in that morning call, Ethan had called it unused land. I replayed those words in my mind one by one like a slow knife. Unused land. As if this place were nothing but an empty space waiting to be filled with concrete and profit. As if the years my family poured sweat, tears, and even blood into it had never existed. I walked up to the old wooden barn. Some of the boards were weathered, but the structure was still solid. My father used to say that if you build something carefully from the start, it can last longer than a lifetime. I placed my hand on the rough wooden wall, feeling each small crack beneath my fingertips. This wasn't unused land. This was living history. When I turned back toward the house, my phone vibrated again. Ethan. I hesitated, then answered. "Have you thought about it yet?" he asked immediately without easing in. "I'm standing on the land right now," I replied, my voice lower. "The land you called unused." There was a brief pause on the other end. Then Ethan spoke, his voice carrying restrained irritation. "Don't make this complicated. I'm just talking realistically." "Your reality," I said. "The market's reality," he corrected. "Look at it, Mom. You're here alone. Maintenance costs money. The grass grows wild, the barn is old. Everything needs fixing. You could live more comfortably if you moved." "Moved where?" I asked, even though I already knew. Claire found some really nice senior living communities, Ethan said, his voice softening in a forced way. They have care services, activities, social events. You wouldn't have to worry so much anymore. It would be better for you. I closed my eyes. In that moment, I saw myself packaged into a future someone else had designed. Neat, convenient, out of the way. An older woman who needed to be placed so she wouldn't interfere with younger people's plans. "How long have you been talking about this with Claire?" I asked. Ethan was silent for a few seconds. That silence was answer enough. "We're just thinking about the future," he said afterward. "Yours too." I let out a short laugh, this time without bitterness. It was low, brief, final. "You're thinking about your future," I said, "and I'm just an inconvenient variable." "That's not true," Ethan protested quickly. "You're reading into it. You always get too emotional." Emotional? The word hung between us like a verdict. I realized with painful clarity that in this conversation, I was no longer his mother. I was a problem to be solved. "Ethan," I said slowly, deliberately, "do you know why your father wanted to keep this land?" "Because of feelings," Ethan replied, impatience in his voice. "I get it. But feelings don't pay bills." "But feelings gave you the foundation to stand where you are," I said. "Without this land, without the people who protected it before you, you wouldn't have the life you have now." "That's the past," Ethan cut in. "You keep clinging to it. You need to be more realistic." I took a deep breath. For the first time since my husband died, since I pushed myself to raise my son alone, I felt something with absolute clarity. I was being pushed out of my own family story. "I'm not sending the paperwork," I said. There was dead silence on the other end. "What?" Ethan asked, his voice dropping. "I said no," I repeated. "This land is not for sale, not to be divided, not for you and your wife's family to profit from." Ethan's tone changed completely. No longer casual, no longer upbeat. It sharpened, tightened. "You don't have the right to be that selfish. I'm your son. This is my future, too." "You don't have the right to take something you don't respect," I replied. "So you're choosing the land over me?" Ethan almost shouted. The question hit me straight in the chest, but this time I didn't step back. "I'm choosing to keep my promise," I said, "and I'm choosing self-respect." Claire was right. Ethan snapped, his voice full of anger. "You've always been controlling. You always think you know what's best." I tightened my grip on the phone. "If controlling means not letting you destroy our family's legacy," I said, "then I accept that." The call ended in heavy silence. No goodbye, no farewell. I lowered my hand and stared at the screen as it went dark. My heart was pounding, not from fear, but from a truth that had just been laid bare. The conflict was no longer simmering. It had officially erupted. I stood there, between the house and the land I had protected my entire life. And for the first time, I understood that this fight was no longer just about property. It was about boundaries, about a mother who had sacrificed too much, finally standing up and saying no, even if the price was the very blood relationship she once believed nothing could ever break. The call ended, but its echo didn't fade. It hung in the house like a thin haze, seeping into every corner, making it impossible to pretend that everything would somehow settle on its own like before. I made lunch, that day in silence, ate a few bites out of obligation, then washed the dishes, my mind completely elsewhere. I knew it clearly. Ethan wasn't going to stop there. And I was right. That afternoon, my phone started buzzing. The first message came from Ethan. short, carrying the familiar tone he used whenever he wanted to soften me. "Mom, I'm sorry I lost my temper earlier. I'm just worried about you. Can we talk again?" I read it, set the phone down, and didn't reply. A few minutes later, another message came in. "You don't understand. Everything I'm doing is for our family's future." Then a missed call. Then 2, then 3. I let the phone sit on the kitchen table, vibrating and going silent again, like a living thing trying to pull my attention. I thought about the times Ethan was little, crying for candy or toys, and how I learned that sometimes if you didn't give in right away, the whining would pass. But this was no longer a child. This was a grown man, and what he wanted wasn't a toy. It was my entire life. By evening, the tone of the messages changed. "You're making everything worse. I don't understand why you're being so stubborn. Claire is really upset. Her family doesn't understand you at all." A deep exhaustion settled over me. Not physical exhaustion, but the kind that comes from a person who has spent a lifetime trying to please others, only to be condemned for finally stopping. The call came around 9 p.m. This time, I answered. "Judith," Ethan said, not calling me Mom, just my name. A small detail, but enough to tell me he had crossed into another territory. "You're backing me into a corner." "You backed yourself in," I replied, my voice so calm it surprised even me. "No," Ethan shot back. "You have all the power. You're holding the paperwork. You're holding the property. You're controlling everything. Controlling. That word again. That property isn't yours," I said. "At least not yet. But I'm your son," Ethan nearly shouted. "Who are you going to leave it to if not me?" The question wasn't curiosity. It was a veiled threat, wrapped in reason. I could hear his breathing on the other end, fast and shallow, as if he were trying to convince himself he was right. "Ethan," I said slowly, "I've already told you. I'm not selling the land." There was a heavy pause. Then his voice shifted completely, dropping lower, colder. "Then don't blame me," Ethan said, "if things go too far." "What do you mean?" I asked. "I'm just giving you a warning," he replied. "The law won't always be on your side. I have my rights." I ended the call. I didn't shake. I didn't cry. But something inside me closed. That was the moment I realized emotion was no longer our shared language. It had been replaced by strategy. The next day, Claire called. I stared at her name on the screen for a long time before answering. Part of me was curious what she would say. Another part of me was already familiar with that pleasant tone people use when they want something. "Judith," Claire said gently, almost warmly. "I just wanted to talk for a moment. Nothing tense." "Go ahead," I replied. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," she continued. "Ethan and I respect you very much, truly, but you have to understand, we're building our own life." "Respect?" I repeated, unable to hide the edge in my voice. "When exactly did you show me that respect?" There was a very slight pause. Then Claire laughed softly, the sound carefully practiced. "You're being overly sensitive. That wedding day? It was just stress. I never meant to push you out." "But you did," I said, "and you never apologized." "I am apologizing now," Claire said quickly. "I just hope we can talk like adults, calmly, rationally." Rationally, a very convenient word often used to cover coldness. "What do you want?" I asked plainly. "I want you to look at the bigger picture," Claire said. "That land, it's too much for you. I'm worried about your health. Really. You can't live out there alone forever." The words sounded painfully familiar, exactly what Ethan had said, as if they had sat together and rehearsed every argument, every sentence. And if you were truly worried about me, I said, you wouldn't have started your marriage by pushing your mother-in-law out of the wedding. Claire's voice stiffened slightly, but only for a moment. Judith, I think you're putting emotions over reason. You're acting selfishly. Selfish. The word was spoken lightly, like a feather, but it landed like a stone. I suddenly understood that in this story the roles had completely reversed. I, the one who had given everything, was now the selfish one. And they, the ones demanding, saw themselves as victims. You've said enough, I replied. There's nothing left to discuss. Judith. I hung up. In the days that followed, the pressure didn't ease. It intensified. Messages came constantly, sometimes from Ethan, sometimes from Claire, sometimes from unknown numbers I guessed were relatives on Claire's side. The content circled the same points again and again. I was overreacting. I was controlling. I was ruining my son's future. Some nights I picked up my phone and reread the messages, wondering if I really was wrong. Was I clinging too tightly to a past that no longer fit? Was I making things difficult for my son because I was afraid of loss? But then I stepped outside, looked at the land stretching under the moonlight, and the answer became clear. I wasn't afraid of losing the land. I was afraid of losing myself. One morning, after waking up to more than a dozen missed calls, I did something I had never done before. I turned my phone off completely. No vibration, no notifications, no screen, lighting up. The house became strangely quiet, as if I could finally breathe. I made tea, sat on the back porch, and watched the wind ripple through the tall grass. For the first time in days, I didn't feel pulled in every direction by other people. In that quiet, I began to think, not about how to calm Ethan, but about what I wanted my future to look like. I had lived too long in the role of the one who sacrifices, the one who gives in, the one who steps back so others can move forward. But I wasn't young anymore. I didn't have time left to fix choices born out of fear. A very small, very faint thought began to take shape. I didn't name it. I didn't dare say it out loud, but it was there, like a seed planted in dry soil after the first rain. If they could make plans behind my back, then maybe I needed a plan of my own. I didn't know then how fast that seed would grow. I only knew that in the moment I chose silence and a temporary retreat, I wasn't running away. I was preparing. I kept my phone off for 2 full days, not to punish anyone, but because I needed to hear my own voice again. The familiar sounds of this land returned, the wind moving through the pines, the barn door creaking as the temperature shifted, my own footsteps on the worn path leading to the forest's edge. In that quiet, one thought grew clearer and clearer, no longer just a seed. If I did nothing, they would do it for me. Ethan and Claire weren't hiding their intentions anymore. They weren't speaking the language of emotion, but the language of plans, of profit, of what was reasonable. And what frightened me most wasn't that they wanted to sell the land. It was how they talked about it, as if this place were nothing more than an obstacle, a burden that needed to be removed so the road ahead could be clear. I had seen too many patients at the hospital lose control over their own lives simply because they were one step too slow. I had always believed that would never happen to me. But now, as my son began talking about rights and the law, I understood that I could no longer rely on motherhood to protect what mattered. On the 3rd morning, I turned my phone back on. The screen lit up almost instantly, showing dozens of missed calls and unread messages. I didn't open them. I searched for one name in my contacts, Rebecca Sloan. Rebecca was the lawyer who had helped me handle the paperwork when Marcus died. She didn't talk much, didn't circle around issues, and always looked straight at the problem. I hadn't seen her in years, but as I pressed the call button, I knew this was the call I needed to make. "Sloan Law Office," a woman's voice answered. "This is Judith Monroe," I said. "I need to see Rebecca as soon as possible." There was a brief pause. Then Rebecca's voice came on the line. "Judith, it's been a long time. Are you all right?" "I need to talk," I said, "about the land." Her tone turned serious. "Can you come to the office this afternoon?" I drove into town in the early afternoon. The familiar road past small shops, the old cafe, the post office where I used to take Ethan to mail letters to his grandparents when he was little. This town had witnessed every stage of my life, from a newly married young woman to a busy mother to a widow trying to stand her ground. And now I was coming back with a different kind of fear, heavier, because it came from my own blood. Rebecca's office was on the second floor of an old brick building. The wooden stairs creaked softly under my feet. When I stepped inside, I smelled paper, ink, and coffee. A very law office smell, very practical. Rebecca stood when she saw me, her brown hair streaked with gray pulled into a neat bun, her eyes sharp but not unkind. "Sit down," she said, motioning to the chair across from her desk. "You look tired." I gave a faint smile. "I probably am." I told her everything. I didn't leave out a single detail. The wedding, the words, "You should go home," the call the next morning, the messages, the accusations of selfishness and control. I even told her about the suggestion to move me into a senior living community as a solution for everyone. As I spoke, Rebecca didn't interrupt. She just listened, occasionally jotting down short notes. When I finished, the room was quiet for a few seconds. Rebecca set her pen down and leaned back. "What's your biggest fear?" she asked. I didn't have to think long. "That they'll destroy the land," I said. "That everything my family built will disappear. That one day I'll be standing there watching bulldozers flatten the place where my grandfather planted trees, where my husband once stood smiling with our son." Rebecca nodded slowly. "Then we need to make sure that never happens." She pulled a folder from her drawer and flipped through a few pages. "You're still the sole legal owner of the land. Ethan has no legal rights to it, unless you transfer it or you pass away without clear arrangements." "I know," I said, "but I don't want everything to depend on unless." Rebecca studied me for a moment as if weighing something. Then she said, "There is a way." She began explaining about a conservation trust, a type of trust designed for land. The property would be placed into the trust with very specific conditions. It could not be sold, could not be divided, could not be commercially developed. Its sole purpose would be preservation, for nature, for the community, for future generations. "The most important thing," Rebecca said, slowing her voice so I would hear every word, "is that once you do this, it can't be undone. Once the land is in the trust, it no longer belongs to you personally. You won't be able to take it back or change your mind." I fell silent. The thought tightened my chest. This land had belonged to my family for so many years. The idea that it would no longer be in my name, even for protection, made me hesitate. "How will Ethan react?" I asked. Rebecca was blunt. "He won't be happy, and you need to be prepared for strong opposition." I looked down at my hands, fingers that had trembled while signing so many documents over a lifetime, but never like this. "If I don't do it," I said softly, "I'll live in fear forever." Rebecca nodded. "That's right. And you also need to understand, doing this isn't revenge. It's setting boundaries. Boundaries. The word echoed in my mind like a belated reminder. I had lived my whole life without clearly drawing boundaries with my son. I thought love meant leaving the door wide open. I was wrong. Without boundaries, love gets invaded. I sat there for a long time, weighing everything. Ethan as a little boy, his hand wrapped in mine as we crossed the street. Marcus standing on the land, telling me I had to protect it at all costs. And Claire's faint smile when I was pushed out of the wedding. "I need time," I said. Rebecca didn't press me. "Of course, but you should know that time is also a factor. The pressure from them won't ease." I stood up, took my bag, and prepared to leave. Before opening the door, I turned back to Rebecca. "If I decide to do it," I asked, "will you help me?" She smiled. Not a comforting smile, but a steady one. "That's my job." On the drive home, I didn't turn on the radio. I drove slowly, letting each thought settle. When I turned onto the dirt road leading back to the house, I stopped the car, got out, and looked around at the familiar land. The afternoon light fell low, tinting the grass gold. A light breeze carried the scent of pine resin. I placed my hand on the trunk of the oldest oak tree and felt the rough bark beneath my fingers. "I'll protect you," I whispered, not knowing whether I was speaking to the tree, to Marcus, or to myself. In that moment, the hesitation inside me began to fade. I hadn't signed anything yet, but I had done something more important. For the first time in my life, I knew exactly where my boundary was, and I was ready to defend it. I didn't return to the law office the very next day. I needed one more night, not to hesitate, but to be sure this decision wasn't born from anger or hurt. I had lived long enough to know the difference between a reaction and a choice. Reactions are impulsive. Choices have to stand even after emotions settle. That night, I slept very little. I didn't toss and turn, and I didn't dream. I just lay still, listening to the house breathe. The wind tapped softly against the window frame. Tree branches brushed the porch roof. Those familiar sounds had been the backdrop of my life for decades, and now they seemed to be witnessing me reach a crossroads no one else could walk for me. The next morning, I made coffee, drank it slowly, then got dressed. Not anything formal or elaborate, just the light brown jacket I usually wore when going into town, the shoes that had been with me for years. I looked at myself in the mirror before leaving. That face had wrinkles and weariness, but no longer confusion. I nodded to myself like a quiet confirmation. When I walked into Rebecca Sloane's office for the second time that week, she looked at me and immediately knew I was ready. There was no long small talk. Rebecca pulled a thick folder from the drawer and set it on the desk. Crisp white pages, black printed text, dry legal language. But I knew that inside was the fate of the land, and also of my relationship with my son. "Before we begin," Rebecca said slowly, "you need to hear this one more time. When you sign, the land will be transferred into a conservation trust. It will no longer be personal property. It won't belong to you, to Ethan, or to any heir." "I understand," I said. "You won't be able to change this decision later," she continued, "even if you want to." "I understand," I repeated, and this time my voice didn't shake. Rebecca studied me for a few seconds, then nodded. She slid the pen toward me. I took it. The pen felt heavier than I expected, not because of its weight, but because of what it meant. I looked at the printed line at the top of the page. Judith Monroe, grantor, the one who transfers, the one who gives authority, the one who ends one chapter and begins another. I signed. Blue ink appeared on the paper, familiar yet strange. I signed the first page, then the second, Each time I put the pen down, it felt like I was loosening invisible cords that had bound me for years. There was pain, yes, a dull ache like pulling a tooth that had been loose for a long time. But right after came a spreading sense of relief, slow and steady. Rebecca turned the page. I signed again. Long, detailed, dry clauses. No selling, no subdivision, no commercial development, no transfer, no exceptions, no conditions. The land would be protected forever, not by emotion, but by law. On one page, in the middle of the file, there was a short paragraph that made me stop. The property shall be removed from the grantor's estate and shall not be subject to inheritance. The property would be removed from the will. I read that sentence twice, then a third time. This was the moment I understood very clearly. With this signature, I wasn't just protecting the land, I was also ending every hope Ethan had ever held, even the ones he never spoke aloud. I was closing the door my son believed would always be open to him, no matter what he did. I closed my eyes for a brief second. I thought of Ethan as a boy, standing on this grass, holding a wooden stick like a sword, declaring that one day he would protect our home. I thought of Marcus, his voice low and weak in his final days, his hand in mine as he said, "Don't let anyone take it away." I thought of my grandfather, of my father, men, who didn't leave me much money, but left me a foundation no one had the right to destroy. I opened my eyes. "Keep signing," I told myself. I signed the remaining pages slowly but firmly, no rushing, no hesitation. When I signed the final page, Rebecca placed her hand on the folder as if to confirm it was done. "It's finished," she said. "From this moment on, the land belongs to the Conservation Trust. It's protected by law." I set the pen down. A brief emptiness passed through me, not from loss, but from something ending. And right after it came a peace I hadn't felt in a very long time. "What do I do next?" I asked. "Nothing," Rebecca replied. "The rest is on me, but you should prepare yourself." "I am prepared," I said. On the drive home, I went slower than usual. I didn't turn on the radio. I let my thoughts drift freely without grabbing onto them. I knew that when Ethan found out, his reaction would be fierce. I knew Claire wouldn't stay quiet. I knew accusations, threats, pleading, all of it would come. But I also knew something else. I was no longer standing on unstable ground. When the car turned onto the dirt road leading home, I stopped once again, as I had been doing these past days. I stepped out and stood in the land, bathed in late afternoon light. The wind moved through the tall grass. In the distance, the old wooden barn still stood, quiet and enduring. I placed a hand on my chest and felt my steady heartbeat. "I did the right thing," I whispered, needing no one else to hear. In that moment, I felt the change inside me clearly. I was no longer the woman waiting for her child's approval, no longer the mother afraid that a firm decision would make her lose everything. I still loved Ethan. That hadn't changed. But I was no longer willing to trade myself to preserve an image of family that no longer existed. I went inside, hung up my jacket, and made tea. Those small, familiar tasks suddenly felt steadier, as if everything had found its proper order again. I sat down in Marcus's armchair and looked out the window. The light faded outside, leaving a calm, deep blue. The storm hadn't arrived yet. I knew that. But when it did, I wouldn't be standing in the open anymore. I had signed. And that signature, irrevocable, was exactly what kept me standing. I knew that call would come. I just didn't know it would come so quickly. The phone rang while I was standing on the back porch, watering the wildflower bed Marcus had planted years ago. The day was slipping toward evening, the sunlight softening, a light breeze making the petals tremble. The scene was so peaceful it was almost cruel, because I knew very well this peace was about to be torn apart. Ethan's name appeared on the screen. I didn't answer right away. I turned off the hose, set it neatly aside, wiped my hands on my pants, and only then picked up the phone. Not because I wanted to prolong the tension, but because I wanted to be truly ready. "Mom," Ethan said the moment I answered. His voice was no longer normal, no longer angry, but breaking in a different way. Please tell me this is all a misunderstanding." I leaned against the porch post and looked out at the land sinking into the colors of dusk. "What are you talking about?" I asked, even though we both knew the answer. "Rebecca Sloan just called me," Ethan said, his voice trembling. "She said you signed something, that the land doesn't belong to you anymore. Tell me, Mom, this isn't true, right?" I took a deep breath, not to gather courage, but to keep my voice steady. "It's not a misunderstanding," I said. "I transferred the land into a conservation trust." On the other end of the line, silence crashed down, a thick silence so heavy I could hear my son's ragged breathing. "No," Ethan whispered. "No, you can't do that. You don't have the right." "It's my legal right," I replied, "and I did it." Ethan's voice broke completely. "Mom, you don't understand. You just destroyed everything, all our plans. Plans you never once asked me about," I cut in, my voice still even. "Plans you thought you could carry out after throwing me out of your own wedding." I heard a strange sound in the background. Footsteps. A woman's voice, sharp and urgent. "Ethan, what's going on?" Claire's voice rang out, not quiet at all. "Who are you talking to?" "Mom," Ethan said quickly, as if afraid I'd disappear. "You have to fix this. I'm begging you. This is too big." "Put Claire on," I said. There was a brief hesitation. Then I heard the phone change hands. "Judith?" Claire spoke. Her voice was no longer gentle. It was sharp, tight, nearly shaking with anger. "I don't understand why you would do this." "You understand perfectly," I replied. "You just don't like it." "This is incredibly selfish," Claire said, each word heavy. "You're not thinking about Ethan. You're not thinking about our family." "I have thought about it," I said slowly. "I thought long and hard, and I chose to protect what my family built instead of letting it be destroyed for someone else's benefit." "Destroyed?" Claire laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I call that development. I call that the future." "A future where I'm pushed aside," I said, "just like you did at the wedding." I heard a sharp breath on the other end. "Judith, you can't keep clinging to that," Claire said. "That's in the past." "It's in the past for you," I replied. "Not for me." Ethan grabbed the phone back. "Mom, I'm begging you," he said, his voice nearly collapsing. "You can change this decision. I know you can." "No," I said, just one word, clear. "I can't. I'll sue," Ethan blurted out. Immediately after, he seemed to regret it. I don't want to, but you're leaving me no choice." "You can try," I replied, "but you won't win." "I'm your son," Ethan almost shouted. "I have inheritance rights." "You don't have rights to something you don't respect," I said. "And Rebecca already explained that to you. The conservation trust is irreversible." On the other end, I heard Claire mutter a curse under her breath. "We'll find another lawyer," she said, loud enough for me to hear. "There has to be a way." I closed my eyes for a second. "You can ask as many lawyers as you want," I said when I opened them. "The truth doesn't change." "Mom," Ethan choked. "You're choosing the land over me." I didn't answer right away. I looked at the land stretching out in front of me, the rows of trees standing still in the fading light. I remembered the moment Ethan looked at me at the wedding, his eyes distant and hard. I remembered the feeling of being told to leave, like an unwelcome guest. "You already chose, Ethan," I said at last. "You chose when you said you should go home. You chose when you called this land abandoned. You chose when you treated me like an obstacle." "I didn't think you'd go this far," Ethan said, his voice shattered. "I didn't think you'd dare." "That's the problem," I cut in. "You didn't think about me at all. You just assumed I would always give in." There was a long silence. This time, no one spoke. I could hear Ethan breathing heavily, hear Claire whispering angrily somewhere in the background. I knew that in this moment, everything in my son's mind was collapsing, not just his plans, but his image of the mother he believed would never say no. "Mom," Ethan said very softly, like he used to when he was little, "I'm scared." I tightened my grip on the phone. My heart ached, but it didn't waver. "You're scared because you lost control," I said, "and I've lived in fear for too long." "So this is really it?" Ethan asked. "That depends on you," I replied, "but this land is settled." I heard a quiet sob, then Claire snapped sharply, "Ethan, stop begging, she's not worth it." That sentence, more than any threat, made everything brutally clear. "I've heard enough," I said. "We'll talk later if there's anything left to talk about." I ended the call. My hand trembled slightly, but not from regret. I sat down on the wooden chair on the porch and watched the last light of day fade. In my chest was a deep sadness, the sadness of a mother realizing the child she raised no longer stood on her side. But at the same time, another feeling rose, a cold clarity. What I had just done wasn't the cause of this collapse. It was only the result. Cause and effect were taking shape, and I knew that from this moment on, none of us could return to the original starting line. Time began to move differently after that call, no longer frantic, no longer suffocating. Days followed one another slowly, as if the land itself were deliberately pulling me back into its natural rhythm. Summer passed, leaving cooler mornings and shorter afternoons. I worked in the garden, repaired the fence on the west side, repainted the barn door. Small, repetitive tasks, but each time I finished one, I felt like I was laying another brick in my new piece. Ethan stopped calling. Not immediately. In the first few weeks, emails still came, forwarded from his lawyer, written in stiff language filled with familiar threatening phrases. Reconsider, dispute, legal rights. Rebecca handled all of it. She replied briefly, precisely, and left no opening. Whenever I asked, she simply said, "There's no progress, they have no case." Then the emails became less frequent. Eventually, they stopped. News about Claire reached me in a way I never expected, through a neighbor who stopped by to help fix a water pipe. He mentioned it casually, like small-town talk. Claire had moved out of the apartment the newlyweds had rented, just a few months after the wedding. I didn't ask for more details. I didn't need to. Later, there was a short email from Rebecca with a simple note attached, "For your awareness." It was a notice of legal separation filed by Claire. No flowery language, no long explanations, just dry, cold text, exactly like the way she had looked at me on the wedding day. I sat in front of the screen for a long time, reading those few lines over and over, not because I was happy, not because I was sad. I just felt empty. The emptiness of someone who had seen what they knew all along, but still hoped it wouldn't happen. Ethan lost his marriage before it ever had a chance to become a family. And with it, he lost the illusion that everything in life could be traded for plans and pressure. The legal threats disappeared completely after the first lawsuit was dismissed. No grounds, no legal interest, nothing to hold on to. Rebecca told me the other lawyer had advised Ethan to stop because the longer it dragged on, the more money he would lose, and the worse it would look if there were ever any future disputes. "He's paying the price," Rebecca said during a call, "and not just financially." I knew what she meant. I heard that Ethan had to sell the new car he'd bought to pay off debts. I heard he moved into a smaller apartment. None of that came from me, and I didn't go looking for it. It arrived on its own, like the natural consequences of a chain of bad choices. As for me, life slowly became peaceful again, in a way I had forgotten was possible. I began attending community meetings connected to the Conservation Trust, not as someone in charge, but as a contributor. I listened to young people talk about environmental protection, about nature education. I saw something in their eyes that I hadn't seen in my son's eyes for years: respect. The land began to change in very small, very real ways. A path was cleared so children could visit safely. One corner of the meadow was left untouched so wildflowers could keep blooming with the seasons. No concrete, no tall fences, just small wooden signs that read, "Conservation Area, please tread lightly." The first time a group of children came to visit, I watched from a distance. They laughed, ran around, pointed when birds lifted from the edge of the woods. A young teacher explained the old oak tree to them, how it had been standing longer than their grandparents had been alive. I saw a little boy place his hand on the trunk, exactly the way Ethan used to when he was small. I turned away, not because it hurt, but because I understood. Life keeps going, even when it doesn't follow the shape we once imagined. In the evenings, I sat on the porch, drank tea, and watched the sun set behind the trees. No more constant phone calls, no more accusations, just insects, wind, and the steady rhythm of my own breathing. I no longer lived in fear that someone would come take something from me tomorrow. Legacy, I realized, was never about money. It is the ability to say enough when greed starts to blur family ties. It is protecting values that can't be converted into profit. It is the courage to accept the loss of a relationship so you don't lose yourself. One afternoon, I received a message from Ethan. Just one short line: "Mom, I'm sorry." No explanation, no request, no plan. I read it, set the phone down, and didn't reply right away. I needed time, and this time I knew I had the right to it. I looked out at the land bathing in the last light of day. The children were gone. Nature had returned to its own rhythm. Everything was quiet. The price of greed had been paid. And the true value of legacy, not something to seize, but something to protect, finally stood clear and undeniable. The letter arrived on a very ordinary morning. Not an email, not a text. A cream-colored paper envelope, slightly thick, placed neatly in the wooden mailbox by the gate. My name was handwritten on it in a familiar yet unfamiliar script, slanted slightly to the right, a bit shaky, as if the writer had paused many times before each word. I held the envelope for a long time without opening it. I knew immediately it was from Ethan. I didn't need to see a return address. I didn't need any other sign. Some things, no matter how much time passes, a mother recognizes by a faint feeling deep in her chest. I brought the letter inside and set it on the kitchen table. Made tea, sat down. Morning sunlight streamed through the window, laying a thin stripe of light across the envelope. It was so quiet I could hear the wall clock ticking. I took a deep breath. Then I opened it. The paper inside was folded into thirds, not expensive stationery, just ordinary letter paper, slightly wrinkled at the corners as if it had been clenched and then smoothed out again. The first word tightened my chest. Mom. Just one word, but different from before. No demands, no blame, no pleading, just a raw, fragile address. Ethan wrote that he had lost many nights of sleep, that when everything collapsed, his marriage, his plans, the things he thought were certain, he finally began to look back at every step he had taken. He admitted that he had let others lead him, had let promises of an easy future blur the past. He wrote that Claire hadn't forced him with orders, but with carefully chosen words, that he believed it was maturity, a way of stepping out of his mother's shadow, that he hadn't realized that while trying to prove he was an independent man, he had betrayed the only person who had never turned her back on him. I read slowly, not skipping a single word. Ethan wrote about the wedding day, about the moment he saw me standing alone by the dessert table. He said he knew then that he was wrong, but he chose silence because he was afraid of upsetting his wife, afraid of damaging his image in front of others. He called it cowardice, his word, not mine. He wrote that when Claire left, he sat alone in the empty apartment and for the first time understood what it meant to be left behind. No one waiting for him to come home. No one asking if he had eaten. No one reminding him to wear an extra layer when it was cold. He wrote that in that moment he thought of me not as a controlling mother, but as a quiet presence he had always taken for granted. By then my hands were trembling. Ethan admitted that he had seen the land as an asset because he had never had to sweat to keep it. He wrote that he had confused the right to inherit with the right to take, that he hadn't understood that legacy is passed on with responsibility, not as an unconditional gift. Then came the part that made me stop. I've thought about everything over and over, and I realized something painful. The only person in my life who truly sacrificed, asked for nothing, never set conditions, was you. And you're the one I hurt the most. I folded the letter, not because I didn't want to keep reading, but because I couldn't. The tears came unexpectedly, not in a rush, not with sobs, just quiet drops falling onto the back of my hand, hot and heavy. It was the first time I had cried since the wedding, not from resentment, not from loss, but from something deeper, because at last my son had seen what I once feared he never would. I sat like that for a long time. The letter lay on the table. The tea had gone cold. Sunlight moved slowly across the floor. At the end of the letter, Ethan didn't ask for the land back. He didn't mention money. He didn't talk about plans. He only wrote that he was sorry, that he didn't expect forgiveness right away, that he only hoped that one day I might be able to look at him without pain. He signed his name, just his name, nothing else. I folded the letter carefully, placed it back in the envelope, and put it into the desk drawer where I keep important papers, not to lock it away, but to let it be there, present, but not demanding. I wasn't ready to forgive, not because I didn't want to, but because forgiveness isn't a door that swings open just because an apology arrives at the right time. It's a long road, and I had gone too far down the path of protecting myself to return to the starting line immediately. That afternoon, I walked the land, a light breeze, clear sky. I stood beneath the old oak and placed my hand on its trunk, as I had done so many times before. I thought of Ethan as a child, of Marcus, of all the versions of myself who had passed through this place. I didn't know what the future would hold. Maybe one day I would answer the letter. Maybe I would invite Ethan here, not as an heir, but as a son. if he was patient enough to learn how to stand beside me again instead of across from me. Or maybe we would keep our distance, a distance not born of hatred but of healing. I didn't rush to decide. For the first time in many years, I allowed myself not to be the one who fixed everything right away. I allowed the future to remain open, not shaped by anyone else's wishes, but by a rhythm I could live with. The letter rested quietly in the drawer, and I, at last, allowed myself to breathe more slowly. My life after that wasn't dramatic, the way people often imagine when a family breaks apart like that. It was quiet, steady, and stronger than I ever expected. I woke each morning with sunlight filling the room. I made coffee, opened the door, stepped onto the porch, and took a deep breath of grass and damp earth. The land was still there, unchanged, needing no explanation. The oak still stood, the path still guided my steps along familiar rhythms. No one came to take anything away. No machines, no billboards, just the quiet continuation of nature and memory. I grew used to this peace, not the peace that comes when every relationship is perfect, but the peace that comes when you stop betraying yourself to hold on to things that are no longer love. I no longer jumped every time the phone rang. I no longer lived in fear that one firm decision would cost me everything. I had lost something, but I had kept something more important. The land now belongs to the Conservation Trust. Children come to learn about nature. Young people plant more trees, repair the paths, place small wooden signs that tell the history of this place. I am not the center of it all, and I don't need to be. I am simply part of the flow, just as my grandfather was, just as my father was, just as Marcus was. I came to understand that true legacy isn't about how much money you leave behind or who gets called an heir. Legacy is about what you choose to protect when you have the power to choose. It's about the values you refuse to sell, even when the price offered is tempting. And sometimes, the greatest legacy isn't what you give your children, but the lesson you force them to learn, even if it comes late. I still love Ethan. That didn't disappear just because he hurt me, but I no longer confuse love with unconditional sacrifice. I once believed that being a mother meant yielding until the end, staying silent to keep the peace, enduring so your child could be comfortable. I was wrong. Love does not mean letting others trample your boundaries, and protecting yourself is not selfish. Sometimes it is the most honest form of love toward yourself and toward others. Some afternoons I sit beneath the old oak and watch sunlight filter through the leaves. I think about everyone who has passed through my life, the choices that brought me here. I no longer ask, what if? I don't wish to go back to any moment to change it. I walked my path, slow, painful, but right. If there is one thing I want to say to anyone listening to this story, it is this. You are not too old to set boundaries. You are not too late to choose yourself again, and you do not owe anyone a sacrifice that costs you your own worth. My life now is not grand, but it is real. It stands firm, and it belongs to me. If you're listening to this story, I would love to know, where are you watching from? From which city, or from what quiet corner of the world? Was there something in this story that felt like it was about you? If you were in my place, what would you do? Please share your thoughts in the comments. I read every line with gratitude. Thank you for staying until the end, for listening to my story with patience and empathy. If this story touched you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow so we can continue listening together to more stories. about family, about boundaries, and about values that cannot be sold. I know that somewhere out there are people who are also learning how to stand upright again. And if this story helps you feel a little steadier, then everything I went through truly meant something.